Venice, for 1,000 years, a serene republic, floating with art and architecture until 1797, when Napoleon marches in, steals the independence, and whatever else he wants. It was his way. Venice had made artists famous, and artists had made Venice memorable. In the 19th century, artists had forgotten the name Francesco Guardi. In the 18th century, the most famous landscape painter here was Canaletto, the most famous artist, Tiepolo. So why would the 20th century be more interested in the imagination and the works of Francesco Guardi? Why in the 20th century is Francesco Guardi becoming the more celebrated of artists? Like Van Gogh, Francesco Guardi was an artist ahead of his time. He had patrons, he had success, he was an academician, admitted and voted in by his peers to the Academy, but not the most celebrated. The influence on Expressionism in later centuries would have to wait. I'm David Dunlop, I'm a landscape painter. I'm going to set up my easel where Francesco Guardi set up his. We're going to look through Francesco Guardi's 18th century eyes. Look at the money shot for Francesco Guardi, the Campanile, the Doge's Palace. Put ourselves in the Piazza San Marco. Take a look at his home district, the Cannaregio, and see how he transformed his impressions into paint, transmuted his experience into his emotional, expressive paintings with a personal vision, a quirkiness, a sense of reinvention unlike any other artist of the 18th century, here in Venice. Francesco Guardi comes from a family of painters. His father was a painter. His brother Antonio was a painter. In fact, Francesco Guardi's sister Cecilia was the wife of Tiepolo. Like so many Venetian artists, he was apprenticed to the workshop of Marieschi and his brother Antonio, who was a figure painter, a Rococo-style figure painter. And it's that Rococo style that we're going to see made more inventive and fanciful in the work of Guardi. He was an artist who really paints in three different directions. He paints completely invented landscapes called the capriccios. He also paints stage sets. It's how all the Venetian painters of his time started, decorator painters. And he paints the landscapes. Francesco Guardi comes late to landscape painting. We suspect it was in his 40s. He'd had the painting tradition, he'd had the instruction. Landscape painting is something that he loved to do. And a market was developing for landscape painting. There was no war. There was wealth, because this town in the mid-18th century was the Las Vegas of Europe. It had lots of licensed casinos, and each casino had lots of courtesans, thousands employed here in Venice for the entertainment of visitors. After all, this had been a tourist attraction for a long time, and the visitors were always the aristocrats and the wealthy. It took a lot to get here. He was fortunate because Canaletto, the most famous landscape painter in the mid-1700s, had been lured to London by his collectors and patrons, Joseph Smith. In the middle of the 1700s, artists like Francesco Guardi or Canaletto or Marieschi, all of the vedute, would wander about Venice in front of the major monuments and position themselves for sketches and setting up their camera obscuras in those piazzas, like this. This is the Fondamente, this is the piazza for Santa Maria della Salute, with a big view of the entrance to the Grand Canal. This noble church was built about a century before. It was dedicated in 1630 because Venice had survived the plague. Only a third of the people of Venice, 46,000, would die. After the saving of the two-thirds of Venice, the grateful city builds this marvelous Baroque cathedral. So outside we have the great sculpture, the great architecture, Baldassare Longhena. Inside we have the great artists, Titians, Tintorettos, and it would be a perfect place for Francesco Guardi to set up and do a preliminary study, a pen and ink, before beginning a painting. It was routine to do these quick studies, and they're just ink washes with the pen and ink lining the edges. You could put the ink down first or second, but you usually began with graphite. So Francesco Guardi, here in the piazza, moves in, to do his study. First in graphite. He's a linear perspective expert, as all of the veduti are, using lines of sight and an eye level for a set of vanishing points. I'm going to show you how that works. As he scans, he looks for his eye level, which he notices about the equivalent with the top of the first floor windows above the canal. And as that continues across, it's pretty close to the top of the steps going into Santa Maria della Salute. A little below that, but for practical purposes, it would be good for him. Remember, he's always going to rearrange the shapes to make a more dramatic narrative. He's not using rulers like the others. He's using personal gestures in the sense of calligraphy. And it's a contour drawing, as we find very sketchily in light, because we'll go over this again with some ink and just find some of the outside shapes. Many of the other artists of this period would be relying on a camera obscura machine, looking into the machine and tracing the drawing like tracing a photograph, but this is before photography, so there's no film, but they would be tracing the reflected image through the lens. Guardi wants something more personal, so he's doing the drawing himself, keeping to the major outside edges. He'd learned a lot about the Rococo, which follows the Baroque. He learns a lot about that sort of flourish in drawing in his painting as well, in his figurative painting, from the workshop of his older brother, Antonio. If I take the top edge, the roof line of this building, the face of this building, and I follow that top edge down, it's slanted very hard down to here. I'm stopping here because that's the central vanishing point, something he would have been familiar with. And I can take that same central vanishing point and pull it back to here and know that parallel walls, parallel lines, are going to converge to this central vanishing point. Anything parallel, like the edge of the fondamenta right here, or the opposite side of the canal, all converging. The flanking sides of Santa Maria della Salute, because they're pivoted, don't share the common vanishing point. So they'll still use the same sight line, but they'll go to a vanishing point off to the right of that one. He can therefore get the illusion of a building turning. This would be a normal part of the vocabulary of any Venetian landscape painter. It's unthinkable from the time of Leonardo da Vinci through Canaletto, through Turner, through Sargent, through Whistler, to not know this material. This you knew as well as you could speak your native language. It was your language. The flanking side of this building, as it moves out to here or to here, to a different vanishing point, is echoed in the bottom of the steps, moving also to there. The other side of the steps move to a vanishing point over here, all still on the same eye level. The eye level is the same. The interesting thing about his use of linear perspective is how it all radiates here from this off-center point. So any of the window lines are going to come down and move to here. And at a certain point, as with Guardi, you're so familiar with the rules and terms of linear perspective, you roughly suggest where the vanishing point is, and the rest you can go freehand because you know the language. Edge of the building, bottom here. One of the principles for organizing the space is intervals equally spaced across the bottom. So I can try this, and out of here the radians go, so I can let you feel this movement across this pavement, back to there. You'll notice something that's interesting. Watch my pencil. As it moves, all these lines seem to radiate as they do. We call these recessionals. They radiate from here. The design then becomes hub and spoke. This radiation principle of the Renaissance, as John Ruskin explained it, is exemplified well in this particular situation, as it would be if Francesco were painting and sketching as he did in Piazza San Marco. This side of this protruding part of the building. It's a big octagonal structure, a very classical choice to use the octagon. So long as it correlates with linear perspective, you don't have to put the same building position or the same building itself in the picture, because the laws of linear perspective will give you credible space. Big flying scrolls, and then some foliage. There was more foliage around here in the time of Francesco Guardi than there is today. The top of this wall. And now I have just a rough contour drawing and an idea of how this might work. In previous centuries, Leonardo da Vinci might take the graphite onto a plaster board and now use silver point or gold point. The advantage of that is that the silver will oxidize and turn black, and you'll get a much richer line. I can also, at this point, start thinking about some elements for the sky. I can echo some of this dome shape. This is a principle of repetition. Show a shape that you've shown before, but distort it. So from here, for example, I might try a cloud shape like this, or I might try it lower, or from the reverse direction. And they're big, billowy clouds because they're not clouds that are derived really from observation. They're clouds derived from looking at other people's ideas of clouds. So the process would be first the graphite, then some ink with a steel point or a croquill pen. A broken line with some nervous wiggle, because that's what Guardi was known for, this sense of calligraphy, the sense of fun that he would place in the picture. Now you have to keep re-inking your pen. You can't just stop and, like I'm doing, talk, because it'll dry out and the ink will move to different sections. You don't have long, it's more like an old-fashioned fountain pen. And like Guardi, I'm modifying the drawing Remember that vanishing point onto this side for the canted side. The washes follow, and the washes describe what he would have called the umbra, the shadow. And they come in usually two values, a light and a dark. But we'll get to that in a minute after we've found where some of these shapes are. They've got these fancy Corinthian column tops because it's the Baroque period and you're not going to put something Doric or Ionic up there, which is not quite as fanciful. At least that's what Baldassare was thinking when he designed the building. And he was selected because of his awareness of those decorative features and how to employ them. While the ink dries fairly fast, it's easy to smear it too as you drag your hand across it. Saving room for some of those 125 fanciful sculptures, I'm only going to do what he would do. He wouldn't paint them all. He would just allude to a fanciful wedding cake of a display. And by the way, the idea of the contemporary wedding cake with all of its fanciful Baroque and Rococo display comes from this period. Because if it was good for the building, it ought to be good for the bride. Everyone else in town is lining their steps with a ruler, not Francesco. He wants something that has more motion, more passion, more excitement. And that happens with this wiggly, calligraphic, personal line. I'm going to mark that central vanishing point for all the parallel lines. Remember, these lines, that one, these, are moving to a vanishing point over here. Let me mark it so you see it. You look at a Vermeer painting from 1600s, you will still see the little pinhole where he used linear perspective to straighten out his lines. The whole process will not take him very long because, after all, usually these were just studies. And some of the feeling of detail will come through the shadows, which, as I say, are yet to be used with the washes. There's the vanishing point, so even the bottom of any wall or any window lines get smaller and telescope into that space. It's so funny to be working inside of this 18th century manner with having to dip your hand back again and again and replenish your source of pigment. And this rough line, because as in the time of Francesco Guardi, so in our time, the commerce and the life that courses through Venice follows the canals. And it principally follows the Grand Canal, right here. Now, the buildings themselves collapse. They are much more squeezed in that distance than they are here, where they open up and widen out. But of course, this is outside of what we call the cone of vision today. The human eye has about a 30-degree lens if it's fixed and immobile. Anything outside of that isn't in the field of vision. And interestingly, only 1% of that field of vision, that's my thumb at arm's length, is actually in focus. By the time we get to the 19th century with Turner, he realizes this, and much of the picture is out of focus. And little foveal points will draw our attention, going from a focus point, a focus point, a focus point. And it was Da Vinci who first noticed that we do not see the entire thing. What we see are just a series of points, and our brain fills in the imagery. It's called a neuroscan path, and it's how we see. It's the washes that will fill in the rest. I, too, am going to slowly fade the focus out to the edge so that we have less visual data out here, and then I'll pack in to sections in here. And what's left over here, by the way, is a funnel chimney. And I'm putting one in just for the fun of it, just so you can see it. I'm going to smear it down a little bit because it was just too obvious. And there are just a few of them left. It was to prevent the embers from falling back on the roof and causing fires, which is why they're all tile roofs. So the landscape today is different on the horizon. Now, any reference to a cloud, as I said, to balance the scene, incomplete, just suggestive, no hard lines. The next step is brushwork with washes. And the interesting thing about these washes is that I've made two different types of wash. I take the ink that I've been using and I would dilute it with water. And I would have one just be very pale, like that. So it's just the vaguest shadow. And so Guardi makes two solutions frequently, a soft solution, which is very pale. And I'll wipe off my brush. Or a darker solution for the deeper shadow. So we have two kinds of effects, lighter and darker. So as I start to do the shadowing, I'll start to do it with the lighter solution. And that starts to fill that in, and I'll show you then what happens with a darker solution. You can always put the lighter down and put a darker over it, but there's no point in putting a lighter over the darker because we won't see the lighter. And this is going down like a watercolor. Others of the time are doing the same thing, like the Bassanos, Jacopo Bassano. There are so many who are all drawing their figures this way. We've been doing this a while, so that even in the previous century, if you were in Rome with Poussin or Claude, you would know this system of ink and wash. knowing that I can make it darker at any point. Now something darker. This is like a value study. Putting in the different layers of dark is like a value study. Francesco Guardi will do many drawings, many sketches to one painting. The subject will be the subject of the painting, and these are the ideas, these are the evidence of a man's imagination at work. So preliminarily, you run through these. Some you'll like just for themselves, but the real purpose of these is to set the stage, to find a template that you could possibly enlarge into some glorious painting. Now I'm going to go to some darker values, just to let you see even darker than I showed you a second ago, really quite rich. And I'm unloading my brush first so that it doesn't drip too much. And if I want it darker, as he might want, I'll just simply add more ink to the mixture so that the ratio of water to ink starts to shift. While Guardi is painting these pictures, you have an idea of the quality and the type of life that was going on here in the middle of the 18th century. It would be natural to have people like Casanova live the sort of decadent life they live with all of the pageantry, with all of the festivals, and so it was a party atmosphere. And the principle of light against dark helps us see where the building is. We just keep exploiting the light against dark. Any place I feel the presence, or as he did, felt the presence of a darker shadow. Shadows are delicate, delicate beasts. They can be prodded, and all of a sudden they're too dark and angry. So they must be coaxed with nuance. Softly, sottovoce. You see how the figure is created. You don't paint the figure. By painting the dark, it shows up. I get a sculpture. And when he's just doing these quick drawings, the sculpture may have no resemblance to the one that's there. It's just one that satisfies his need for a sculpture of a certain scale, and he finds a figure in it. Just by painting the outside, the dark, and letting the light do the rest, give you the idea of a figure. Each one, of course, getting smaller as they go back in perspective to that vanishing point, the tops of the heads. And he didn't need to line it with a ruler because he knows how recession works. So we get those figures catching a little light from the back side. A little more activity, commotion along the Grand Canal. Occasional wall in shade. Just as here and here, and by separating the bristles on the brush, you can allude to the fact that they're steps. Now a little stronger umbra on the pavement, cross-hatching with my brush. In this city, everybody knew everybody. Everybody was writing about everything. One of the principal writers of this time is Senator Gradeno, who's told us about Guardi standing here and doing these sorts of sketches. We also know that Casanova himself writes about a dinner with his brother Antonio and talks about Francesco Guardi. Bigger windows to smaller windows. And a little bit darker onto this roof line to help separate. Contrast separates the bright part of the dome from here, and this will help separate. See how it pushes the dome back? You might develop some more variegated wash, but we're just using two values of wash. A light wash, a darker wash. And now a little bit darker back in here. While it's wet, you have a little bit of time to dampen the effects. Francesco Guardi will do many of these in a day. This is preparatory for paintings. Whether it's here at Santa Maria della Salute, whether it's over at San Marco in the piazza, or in his own home district, the Cannaregio, and where the Grand Canal connects to the canal of the Cannaregio, a favorite place of Guardi's to paint. We're going to set up our easel where he did and paint that scene in the Cannaregio. So Francesco Guardi comes late to landscape painting. It's in mid-1700s that Francesco Guardi and Canaletto are both elected to a new Academy of Painters. He's able to get a number of commissions, one from Pietro Edwards and one for the Bucentoro series. This city, Venice, is so dependent upon water, its identity, its soul, its sense of itself and its relation to nature come via the water. There's an annual festival called the Festa della Senza, where they take their most decorated ships, the Bucentoro and the Doge. They head out into the bacino. They go out onto the water at San Marco and re-establish their vows with the sea. They actually donate or sacrifice gold rings to the sea as a symbol of this marriage to the sea. We know Francesco Guardi made his sketches, drawings, and maybe even his paintings here. We're not sure about where he made his paintings. So I've put my easel about where he put his. In his time, this was actually a canal. So we're about 10, 15 feet over from where he set his easel. He wasn't alone, though. Marieschi, Canaletto, many other artists paint right here. So we're going to explore the methods and materials and the points of view of Francesco Guardi, using some of the tools, the intellectual tools like linear perspective, and the palette and the colors of Francesco Guardi. The 18th century landscape painters of Venice tended to find the same menu of views. It wouldn't be until the end of the 19th century that a new criteria for creating scenes would be developed. While this is the Grand Canal, that is the river of the district of Cannaregio, the home district of Francesco Guardi. In the 18th century, there were many tools used by the Venetian landscape painters. One of the most popular of those tools was the camera ottica, or the camera obscura. This device is used by landscape painters all over Europe at this time. So it wasn't unique to them. They just used it uniquely in their setting. And what the camera obscura does is it's like a film camera, except there's no film. So they put the camera, which is a wooden box like this with a lens, and they put a black hood over their heads to make it all dark inside. And the image of what's outside is reflected through the lens onto a surface, a flat surface, which they're able to trace. Then they take their tracing back to the studio and build a grid on their easel and then enlarge the grid so that they can have some drawing that is almost photographically exact. It makes the act of drawing very easy. Now there's a question about whether or not he used the camera obscura, the camera ottica, but one of the things we know that these landscape painters did was they sketched. And they sketched in graphite, and they sketched in pen and ink. This is an example of their pen and ink sketching. Do a graphite drawing. On top of that, place your pen and ink drawing, and then some pen and ink washes. In 1720, Marieschi was standing right about here, and he paints this scene. It's the same scene with the exception of some newer buildings that have been added, church and others. But the traffic is still busy, as it is here for us. Over here is Francesco Guardi. Again, some of the buildings have changed by the time he's painting this scene in the 1760s versus this scene in the 1720s. So in 40 or 50 years, this scene has changed already. But one of the things that's in common is, down here you'll see that there's a little bit of water, less than 50%, then the buildings, and a lot of sky. A lot of sky. So we've got a linear horizon using linear perspective. So we've got this sort of a shape, and that shape is a triangular shape. That's why that tower is so important, because we make a triangle of the design, just as a smaller echoing triangle is made right here in this canal. Very subtle, very slight. So if we were just to diagram closely to Francesco Guardi's principles of composition, an Italian tradition would be to first draw a rectangle. Note that the water occupies this territory, and the tops of the buildings will have an asymmetrical triangle moving like that. This apex would be the tower. Then we find interesting lines moving along like so. And in our case, I'm going to incorporate some of the new buildings. And so you see there's an outline, and it's just a little form of notation. So if I take sight lines, and my sight line is just above the water, it's my eye level, just above the water, first layer of windows, and I just start drawing linear perspective vanishing points to that. I can see how my buildings will start to line up in a way that Francesco Guardi would have lined them up. It was Leon Battista Alberti, back in the 15th century, 1436, in Della Pittura, that describes the tradition of scribing the outside edges of the picture so that you know where the design is contained. You're designing to these edges. You'll also know where the middles are, and you know to avoid the middles because they put things in stasis. As Da Vinci said, aim for flawed symmetry. And so Francesco Guardi would do the same. And so marks like this were made by artists for centuries. What they're following is a tradition that goes back to ancient Rome, to Cicero, to Virgil, and that is they're building a window on space, a verisimilitude window, and the tool of linear perspective gives you a sense of verisimilitude, in other words, like looking out the window. That's why the picture goes in here. It's flat across here, but goes in with linear perspective to help give that sense of deep space. That's what makes the pictures so alluring in these landscape paintings of the 1700s. They begin with an iron oxide like burnt sienna. And then the paintings begin through a process of layering. Same principles today that you would learn in any art school is to go from the general to the specific. So details are last. We'll get the tone blocked in and those iron oxide tones of burnt sienna. And then those are rubbed in and out to try to find the form. There usually, for them, would be a drawing underneath the painting. And remember, we marked that the water would be low. And it's just a slight indentation. The vanishing point on the sight lines, so I know where it is. The tower, our tallest feature, so don't let these buildings get too tall. Just out of the middle, the tower itself. More buildings heading in. The wall, which was the same wall that was here then as now. Everything's still flowing back to a vanishing point back in here. So apart from these walls, which are turning, so while the sight line, the eye level is here, first level of windows, as the walls over here on these buildings turn, they start to turn in, this vanishing point moves closer toward a center. That allows the illusion of a turning building. I want to keep this dome lower than this tower. Remember that Guardi and the others, but especially Guardi, is not going to be faithful to the building's location or shape. He's going to design a picture that is for him emotionally persuasive, which is different than architecturally or geographically accurate. Accuracy is not his guiding principle. And so I'm going to try to follow some of that idea of his in painting this scene with you now. I just have a few brushes, some flat brushes. The iron oxide is right here. That's the brown, that's the burnt sienna base, ultramarine blue, an azurite, white, a vermilion, which was available then, and a yellow. The yellows could range from a gamboge to a lead tin yellow, even to an ochre yellow, which is more opaque. He didn't have cadmium yellow. They wouldn't be available until the end of the 19th century. So the blocking in is done after a sketch is put on, which is much more accurate than the sketch I've got. He would have been much more meticulous in that translation of sketch. And I'm going to put a little bit of walnut oil on my brush first. Now I'm going to reach in here and pick up some of this iron oxide and smear it across the drawing. The graphite will dissolve into the paint. And this is just to put this substrate, this subtone, onto the painting. And it's the same subtone we'll find in almost all of the Venetian landscape painters. In fact, English painters, Italian landscape painters in general, in the 1700s, would be using this color underneath. Because of its red, yellow character, it acts as a complement to any overlaying glaze of blue. That was done with big brushes or a rag. The other ingredient that could be used is, we still call it Venetian turpentine. And so they would find it here, only they call it aqua regia, the angry water. And smooth out. Now I'm going to lift some of that up so that it won't pollute the colors that I put on top. If you're working layer by layer and letting them dry in your studio, you don't have to do that. You can just do this, let it dry, put another layer on top. But because we're doing this alla prima, all at once, we're going to pull off some of that color that's on top. Even as I pull out the image, you start to see the silhouette of the city, which was suggested in the drawing. The apex of the design, it's a tall, skinny tower, and the skinnier I make it, the taller the effect. Now, like Guardi, I'm going to take some liberties so that I can keep this being the apex. So I'll probably push the dome lower and make it a little smaller so that I can keep this as the apex of the triangle, which is the core of the design. And that's exactly what Francesco Guardi would do. Subordinate everything to a singular theme or principle. Later, John Ruskin in the mid-19th century would call that the act of principality, of subordinating everything to a central motif. You can see how you can go forward and backward in this process. As we find a dome which was not there in Francesco Guardi's time. It's been added since. It could still be an old dome because, of course, it was about 1760 when he's here. Now you already see something of a silhouette. I'm removing more of the paint to get your eye to move back, creating a vortex down in this section here. And I'm removing also more of the paint so when I put something blue and light on it, it doesn't go too brown. And that will be true down here as well. So we can go into the scene using linear perspective. Deep into the scene. The smaller things are, as he knew with linear perspective, the farther away they appear. So the smaller we make this territory in that vortex, the farther away it is. Some big planes of light, so we can see roughly where the bigger planes of light are landing, knowing that they're all going back to a vanishing point when they're parallel lines to here. and we just get big shapes locked in place. Now, to find a higher degree of contrast, he could mix in some blacks, or he could take some blue into his brown. Either way, he'll get something much darker in tone. And you can see how dark the tone gets depending on how much of this dark blue I add into this iron oxide. We could also do that with black. This gives it a greenish tone, and his paintings are known for some of that greenish cast with the blue-green that we see in them. And I'm now just drawing some vertical lines down to put in some darker territories, shadowed areas, which are fast changing because light is that way. It's ephemeral. He has an understory which is more stained than the upper stories, which you see here, and they're all in this building. It's darker down in here. Than it is above. We're still just roughing in the scene. The rest is quite washed in light at this time of day. Our painters tended to paint at the evening or beginning part of the day because the light is more dramatic. And then pull out for more light, more luminescence. I'm going to add some blue and white next. Even if I were just to put this blue down on top of this, we'd get a greener effect than putting the pure blue itself. But for the moment, I'm going to increase the contrast in some areas. And I'm doing that by removing some of the paint with oil on my finger. We've been finger painting a long time. Da Vinci is noted for being a great finger painter. And we'll go through what he will do himself, light and dark territories, just to get a band of light and dark. More light over here. In the confusion of buildings. Now let's apply some of that blue. To do that, I'm going to use a clean brush so that I don't have polluted color. I take some white and mix it with this color. And a little bit of red to give it a bit of a violet or a grayed blue-violet touch. And I'm going to cut a silhouette of the city again, just as I did by wiping out earlier. Remember, like Guardi, I'm going to continue to make this lower and lower. I took some red and some of this blue to make something that was a little deeper. And I'll probably go even a little deeper, a little bluer and darker right now, so that the buildings show up a little bit more with a little bit more of this azurite type blue, so that the saturation is darker. And we're just getting contrast. We're not going to put any figures or dancing in yet, because that happens as he works into the paint. Now, all of those painters, whether you're Canaletto or whether you're even Leonardo da Vinci, are obligated to paint and decorate ceilings, walls, do evening entertainment decorations, set pieces, theater pieces. In fact, Kenneth Clark believes that landscape painting is born right here in Venice. And it is an outgrowth of the theater sets that were so common here for so many centuries. So it's just still one set of edges. We know that any stage set has to have this proscenium moving forward. It has to have a flank on the left and a flank on the right. Those are the curtains for the stage set. So while Guardi and Canaletto and Marieschi and Ricci were decorating stage sets, they learned how to compose landscapes. So the skies are theatrical skies like Tiepolo's, like Piazzetta's, who are also alive and friends and relatives at this very moment. Now, I'm going to make this a little grayer to set up the stage for something that's a little stormier. So to get a little bit of a stormier sky, I'll go over here with something a little darker. He's the one who likes drama. He's been looking at Giorgione's Tempest, which today is over in the Accademia Museum here in Venice. And we'll frame that darkness with this side too. The greater the contrast, the more drama, just as Guardi knew there would be. And to really frame it like a Venetian stage set, you would have curtains left and right of the picture. And so the sky will offer you a dark curtain on this corner, and a dark one on this corner, to get you to move into this territory of the painting. And again, the greater the contrast, the greater the drama. Now that's going to have a little bit of its reflection, but he goes pretty green usually down here. So we'll just increase this blue with this brown so you can see how that color starts to happen. Mix this color with this color and you get a Grand Canal color. That's this brown with this blue. Get the water of the Grand Canal. More of the brown, more of the blue. I'll stand back here to see how I'm doing from my perspective. And what Guardi's going to do is put an even deeper value down in here just to remind him of how dark the threshold is, whether or not it's there. Now it turns out as the sun arcs across the sky here in Venice, it's going to cast a shadow onto the Grand Canal, which will show itself as a darker territory of water and will help him hold on to this threshold of dark that's at the bottom. Any artist, whether you're in the 18th century like Francesco Guardi or any vedute, knows that if you're doing anything, even your sketches outside, you want to pull back to see how you're doing, especially if you've set up an easel in your painting. So you walk back to evaluate your process, and you do it all the time. You do it to the extent that John Singer Sargent wore a groove in his carpet, walking back and forth. I'm going to mix more white and blue together right now. That same azurite blue, not the expensive ultramarine. And start to build up some I'm going to lift some of that paint off too right now. As we get a little more turbulent sky. And lift some of that light out of the water. As he also tries to get effects from his touches of texture and lifts off the paint to reveal some light. He will also be adding it. So it's a give and take. Add, subtract, add, subtract. Later it will be mostly glazes. I can move to a slightly smaller brush. We've gone from bigger to smaller. All flats. One of the best gifts an artist could receive in the time of Titian to the time of Guardi was a gift of brushes. They were expensive. Finally, though, by the time of Guardi, you could start to think about hiring other people to make your brushes for you. By the mid-19th century, 100 years later, you can go to the art store and buy them. And this sort of sky, with so much motion and excitement, is a sky that's typical of Guardi more than any of the others. Now, as we go in, we can start to use the smaller brush to find a different aspect to the buildings. More turbulence in color and effect. You can see by the way the brush is being tweaked and moved about, something he learned as a Rococo painter with his brother. Turbulence, motion, and all of this swirling. It's kind of a Rococo effect. Again, learned from his brother. I have on the ground over here some paintings by Marieschi and Guardi and others, and I can refer to them to see that I'm keeping my palette and colors at least true to what they used. I keep dipping into that oil, same oil he would have had. Walnut oil was a popular oil, poppy seed oil, linseed oil. And try to find the building in terms of its shadows. I can take some of the colors I've put into the water and put them up on the building. His palette is pretty simple and limited with these blues and browns. And little notes of yellow, which are just about ready to come. I'm going to mix that yellow green with the red and make it a little orange. And pull ourselves back into that space with some bands of light and dark. The sun gives you a terrific illusion about what color you have. The sun lets you think you have color you don't have, and it hurts your eyes. So none of them would do that. They always make sure they're painting in the shade, even if it's in sunlight. So I'm going to move my canvas farther over so that I can sustain the relationship to the shade. Okay. Of course, one of the joys of Venice are domes and towers. That's one of the reasons I'm sure Guardi painted this, apart from the fact that it was his old neighborhood he was looking at. When Francesco Guardi begins his career as an apprentice of his brother Antonio, one of the things that changes for him is he was looking to paint new possibilities, do more than be a figure painter for his brother. Venice wants him to decorate the walls of churches, the walls of buildings, to decorate boats themselves. And so he's employed at first, as almost all Venetian landscape painters are, he's employed to do stage sets, decorations, and he's not alone in this. This is a tradition that goes back centuries. Leonardo da Vinci, who's just a number of miles straight across from here in Milan, hired by the Duke Sforza, is required to do the same thing. Maddeningly, as far as he was concerned, but that was to paint evening entertainments, set designs, decorate rooms for birthday parties, paint the walls for children of the Duke. You see how limited the palette is, and by staying so limited. In the 19th century, you could have expected French, some Germans, but a lot of English. And for the English, especially the English aristocracy who could afford to stay here, they wanted mementos, and the mementos were the paintings of Canaletto and of Guardi. So the market was to keep those people coming. As with any tourist business, there's a residual benefit to everyone, to all of Venice. And then the myth of Venice is spread, and it spreads across to America, it spreads to England, it spreads to France, through the painters like Francesco Guardi. Since Babel, the tower has been an expression of our reaching for heaven. Venetian painters, like Venetian architects, direct our vision toward heaven. Towers like this were symbols of authority and information, with their clocks and bells chiming the hours. Towers and domes like these identified neighborhoods. Guardi's neighborhood, this Cannaregio. Domes and towers were central design elements for Venetian painting. The top of the dome or tower was an organizing source for the design. Like Canaletto, Guardi chooses the profile of Venice, with these towers and these domes as his subjects. Since art history began in the 16th century with Giorgio Vasari, author of Lives of the Artists, we have wondered who was the artist of record? Who made these marks, these hands, these faces, this drapery, these backgrounds? From Renaissance painting contracts, we know that the master of the workshop only painted parts of these pictures, parts of the fresco. He might paint the faces and hands, as stipulated in the contract, and his apprentices would paint the skies in the background. Sometimes he'd call other artists in to help him. Da Vinci, too, in Verrocchio's studio, later in the 15th century. He thought of himself as a part of a team. He painted on the painting of Verrocchio's Baptism of Jesus with Botticelli. He painted one angel, Botticelli paints another. Da Vinci paints the background, Verrocchio paints the face and body of Jesus. This was collaborative painting. And this collaboration of artists in a studio was north to Rubens as well. When Rubens was looking for a scene requiring animals, he simply called in a specialist. This tradition extended to Guardi's Venice. The collaborations continued here. Tiepolo probably painted in selected figures in the paintings of Canaletto. Guardi worked in his brother's studio and jointly on projects. He worked with Marieschi in his studio, and maybe with other painters, maybe with Canaletto. Art was a business, and if painting was better because of collaboration or because of use of optical machines like the camera obscura, then that would be the course it would have to take. The principle is always contrast. Even in working on this picture, I can see how Guardi had in mind the paintings of Giorgione or Titian, because you can feel that sense of drama that he's inherited from the 16th century. Guardi is employed to show us Venetian pageantry. If you're a Venetian, you want to capture that pageantry. You want to provide and document the pageantry of Venice. You believe in the serene republic. You have pride in this place. Rome has been sacked many times, while Venice stood firm and independent. In the 16th century, in the time of Titian, Venice is painting beautiful pictures with him, with Giorgione, with Bellini, with Lorenzo Lotto. Meanwhile, Rome is being sacked. What we've got then is the sense of pride and community that is unparalleled, and so we have so many landscape paintings in some of the same places. Like Guardi, I'm segmenting the turn. The advantage of the flat brush and the pointed brush. The flat brush gives you a nice sharp edge to exploit what's going on here. Can push the sky into a position to help you define the buildings and the shapes. And Guardi knew the advantage of visual noise as well. That is, make a bunch of texture and let people guess into it that it's something. It's how our brain works neurologically. It's perceptual psychology. That we manufacture detail. As Leonardo da Vinci said, to make detail is to hinder the experience of detail. So just do a lot of suggestion. These vedute of the mid-1750s, some of them bought that idea and some of them not. Guardi was more persuaded of the value of ambiguity than, let's say, Canaletto, who is today criticized for his overemphasis on ruled, taut lines and linear sense of detail. It constrains the sense of emotion and rhythm in the picture. Because this painting is lopsided in balance in favor of this, I'm going to make this territory smaller so that we can go back to feeling how strong this central column should be and subordinate this architecture over here, just as Francesco Guardi took the same kind of license. To do that, I'm going to go in with the paper towels and start to remove some of the paint to see how much smaller I need to make this so that the sense of space takes over from this architecture in this side of the picture. Remember Da Vinci, flawed symmetry, and this is unbalanced symmetry. So if I move this building down to about that height and shorten it up to be here, and put the dome down here, we have a better relationship in the triangle, and we'll get some more sky. So out you come, because fidelity to the scene is secondary to the experience of the design, which contributes to the emotion. Here's where capriccio takes over. That is the invention of the painter himself to change the scene. Now see how the priority is reasserted by the column? Once this is shorter, we get more of this relationship. That's a little better, and still this territory feels awfully big in terms of the demand for attention that this wants to take. And I can exaggerate the drama and let this overlap more of the tower. And with the principle of overlapping, once this starts to overlap the tower, it moves it in front of the tower. So when it was adjacent, we don't have the sense of space. Now this is bigger and therefore can move forward. Shorten this up so that it doesn't occupy the same distance as this space. I've moved the entire piece down. Now we'll go back to put in some sky and help find the outside edges of what's just been happening. This is the act of invention of capriccio. Now see how much more established the triangle is than it was a moment ago. This gives us stepped up, so we're stepping up, 1, 2, 3, just climb the steps up to here and then climb back down. Certainly a more satisfying design. Test my grays before I put them on. make this building shorter to make this one appear taller, even though this wall is not doing what we see in the information before us. Now the piazza, there's a small piazza, a small courtyard, which is right out in front, which will reflect light. And the purpose of this is just to get the light to bounce up. And we'll get light to bounce off the bottom of the piazza up onto the building a little bit here too. As I mentioned earlier, Venice was famous for turpentine. We call it Venetian turp. And they would mix that to pick up some texture. The problem with turp is that as you apply it, as they noticed, as Guardi noticed, is that it tends to expand once you touch it to something. So you mix it sometimes with a little oil and then try to build in your effects. Brightening down here, because it's a more effective cleaner than the oil by itself on the brush, and will leave traces of texture. And again, anything light and dark back in here, so I have some variety. Just so that there's variety. Now in running a line, again with the turp, I'll pick up more light, so it gets a little brighter glare. And if I pull off more light on the dome against the dark sky, the dome moves forward too. The face on these buildings, we'll put some more shadow in this. This morning it was the shadowed side. As the afternoon, we've progressed from time of day, so I don't have that light there now. But remember, in all probability, Guardi's paintings were painted in the studio, so he uses a constant light as he remembers it from his sketches and drawings. And he doesn't have to worry about the fleeting light. That painting on location experience is waiting for the 19th century. I want to keep it more neutral gray. The idea of violets and shadows is, again, a 19th century experience. We don't see so much of that in the 18th century. That can be a color that's in the sky, but not so much in the shadows. I have to keep reminding myself to go back to the palette of the 1700s, because my own predilection is to go toward the palettes that are more contemporary and what we've learned in terms of simultaneous contrast. It helps propel this section forward. He knew that if he got too much turp, he would start to have this creep problem. So Going to highlight more of that tower, continue to build up textures, because so much of the surface is the effect of thinned color, transparent color with texture. As with Canaletto, as with Guardi, as with all of these painters, a light touch allows them greater evocation of atmosphere, space, and varieties of texture on the faces of the buildings. Softer touch, more expression. Guardi was unique in that, having come from his brother's Rococo figure studio, he had learned to make a calligraphic type of line, something that he would employ later with figures and other features of the painting in the clouds. And that calligraphic light touch is a touch he's known for, a tocca, a touch that is light and figurative and expressive, that seems to be particularly Guardi's. The nature of the touch, the physiology of the touch, drives expression. In ancient China, calligraphy was revered as a form of art for centuries. The sure, light, confident touch, expressed in a single exhalation, the life force, the qi, comes to the viewer through the artist's touch. Their expression was the hand can't dance unless it's inhabited by an idea. And Guardi's hands were full of ideas. They were practiced early in the Rococo studio of his brother. His dancing gestures suggest the movement of the music and the dance that floated through Venice, the music of Vivaldi. After Guardi, reverence for expressive touch continued in Italy, and it continued to be an esteemed feature of Italian painting. In the following 19th century, we have the macchiaioli, named after the macchia, or the word for touch or stain. Guardi has anticipated the future reverence for touch as a source of expression. You're seeing the effects of the terp right now, Guardi's terp. Remember, he's lifting off so that the ground of the color that's underneath, the light color that's underneath the painting, continues to show through. So the paintings seem to have a luminance that opaque painting, or subtractive painting, that is, when you add more paint, you subtract more light. When you subtract paint, you add more light. And what the Veduti are doing, Canaletto, Marieschi, Guardi, is subtracting paint frequently, thin paint in glazes, to get that feeling of luminescence. They didn't invent it. Da Vinci uses a similar technique as he starts to paint in oil the Last Supper over in Milan. This is such a different tradition than the fresco painting. What we're doing here in Venice is painting in olio, in oil, and olio sul tela, on linen. It was really pretty much an invention here in Venice. Veronese is in this town, and he's looking for a material to paint on because he doesn't want to paint the frescoes. The frescoes are flat, they're dull. He can't get the kind of blending and luminous effects from thin, transparent paints as he can get from the oil. He's seen Titian do this, he's seen Giorgione do this, he's seen Bellini do this, and he just wants to work bigger. And so what he does is he takes a look around, and in Venice at that time, certainly more than now, all the ships were sailing ships, and those ships required canvas for the sails, lots of it. And so Veronese goes into one of those shops and said, I'd like to buy this, and I'm going to prime it with an oil ground and see if I can't get something that will allow me to paint in oil and put it up and cover a wall, but with more luminance than any fresco. Even Albrecht Dürer is going to come down from Germany and meet with Bellini, Gentile, and Giovanni to say, how are you getting these wonderful effects? And they tell him, some poppy seed oil, some walnut oil, some sunflower oil, and our pigment. And with that, we're able to get an effect that is so luminant, so transparent, the light seems to come from within the painting itself. That's the tradition that really begins here in Venice, and that many think the Van Eycks or Durer brought back to the Netherlands, brought back to the North Country. I have to keep graying my color. My temptation is to use those violets and shadows because of my own training with simultaneous contrast and thinking of Delacroix and Chevreul and the Impressionists, but that's not how they're working, and I have to pull myself back and go, grays, David, not violets in these shadows. You see how light the paint is when I'm able to pull it off with these terps and oils. You can get sparkling whites, not by applying the white, but by finding the light that's being reflected through the paint. While all of the other artists are busy painting in calligraphic squiggles to represent the idea of wave, let me show you. When you and I decide to do a wave, we do just what Canaletto or Marieschi did. We think of wave as this form, a wave form. That's our icon for wave. Even ancient Egyptians, it's a symbolic representation of what we think of as waves. As human beings, it's our model, it's our prototype, it's our paradigm. It becomes almost the letter, as you can see, the letter W, which, by the way, is not a coincidence that it fits like this for water. Now, this calligraphy, Guardi painted this as well. But remember, he's an observer. He notices that the water has these transitions in value. He notices that there is translucence, and that if he superimposes these little repetitive calligraphic notes, it makes the work less dramatic. So he dispenses with those little calligraphic light lines on top in the water and goes instead for something of a general mirror effect, which I'm going to do in just a second now. First, continue to deepen the bottom. And drag the brush to get ripply patterns. Deepen it with that brown, that iron oxide. Get that dark threshold. And as Guardi does, let the brush patterns themselves suggest the water rather than rely on the calligraphy of an added lettered stroke. Deeper, down here. So he's getting a transition from darker to lighter, which also brings you back in space. a little more of a stain bleeding into the water. And before I start thinking of other things, I'm going to think about some of the qualities of reflection. I'll put a few more because at different times in his career, he was dedicated to some sense, more or less, detail. And the detail is just enumeration. One of the things he does is he evolves away from enumeration. At this stage, he's still doing that enumeration of windows and more specific information. Later, the paintings become more expressive as he uses less of that reliance on enumerating items that are in the scene. It's only to give us a sense of the reflection possibilities that are going to be here. And again, you can do this by adding color, waiting for the paint to dry, or you can subtract the paint. You have two choices, and so did Francesco Guardi. So the echoes are reciprocal, they're vertical down into here. The one method is to just go ahead and continue to lift, and when I lift, I'll mix some of the color that is already down. And you get the feeling of reflection. Now the reflection is never going to be as strong as the color above it. It's always weakened because what's happened is this catches the original light, this is the reflected light, and the reflected light is never as saturated, never as intense a color, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. That's an observation Francesco Guardi had made in the 1700s. Because he's doing this in his studio, he lets paintings dry and can work on multiple paintings at a time. Go back, add a glaze here, work on this one in an earlier stage, it becomes dry, and once the painting is dry, it's more receptive to adding the glazing. In our situation here, we're not going to wait for this painting to dry, we're doing this alla prima, all at once. And because of the nervousness of his touch, he lets the activity of the water interfere with the accuracy of the reflection, so it shimmers. Browner and duller. So some of the color is, no matter how diluted, is still showing up down below. As in the time of Francesco Guardi, gondolas. And the gondolas from the different sestieri, the different regions of Venice, compete. There is pride in Cannaregio. First, he is Venetian. Secondarily, he is from Cannaregio. Now, annually, as in the time of Francesco Guardi, there is a race of the gondolas. Each community sends their best and compete, kind of like the Palio in Siena with the horse race. If they were here then, they were here for him as well. And he lets them disguise themselves in the shadows of the foreground. As before, I'm going to go back and redefine sections of the sky. And as before, the narrower I make this tower, the more vertical it appears. Domes like this we don't just owe to Rome. We owe to the influence of the architects of Venezia. The principal architect, most famous one, is Sansovino, from the era of the Doges Andrea Gritti. He had a great writer, Aretino, he had his great painter, Titian, and he had his great architect, Sansovino. But another great architect has his influence here, from here to Vicenza, and he would influence the architecture in the United States through Thomas Jefferson, and that's Palladio. And that dome, of course, reminds me of Palladio, who's drawing his inspiration, as so much of the architecture does here, from Rome and Vitruvius. And now I have another brush, a round. Guardi also used rounds in addition to the flat. I'm going to start darker, just to put some element to hold the attention on down here, as he did with the gondolas of his time, which all were hooded and covered in a way that we don't see much today. because this is darker, I'll go in with this and help shape the top cupola. And push some of the angle down here. Naturally, there's more activity that piles up with smaller craft in his time as in ours. I'm going to test to see how dark the notes are. Just to put some confusion into the scene. And again, he's pushing contrast. I have to remember to push contrast because that's where drama lies. Anytime you exaggerate the contrast, you exaggerate simultaneously the drama. I come into this yellow, remember to make it a little bit orange because he did not have this pure of a yellow. Just didn't exist for him. Turner finally gets a good yellow in about the early part of the 19th century with chrome yellow. Doesn't exist for Francesco Guardi. And then to keep it thin, so the light keeps coming through the color, I keep adding the terp to the color. Add some more of those reflections in here to again draw your eye back into that kind of space. Line up more of those reflections. The reflections in Canaletto's work are much more static than they are in Guardi's. And by the time we get to Turner, we really have some pretty liberated reflections. This reference of the reflection back to the object helps repeat the idea that it really is a floating city. We know this is all water because of the quality of reflection and the animation of the surface. So I don't want to make any of these static. I want them to wiggle. I want them to blur. I want them to have some sense of motion and chaos. I've just noticed that these are bending in a way that isn't visible to me from this perspective over here. Information happens along edges. You and I are edge detectors. Edges suggest architecture, foliage, skies, the nature of the edge, whether it is sharp and rectilinear, as here, architecture. The more darkness on the sides, the more I can accentuate some of this activity. And I'm just stand back again. Cecilia, Francesco Guardi's sister, wife of Tiepolo, is unfortunately a victim of Venice. The casinos could victimize even artists like Tiepolo because Cecilia, somehow at the gaming tables here, when she runs out of money, Tiepolo's money, she loses his drawings. And then she says, I will put up my husband's studio and house, hoping to win it back and not be embarrassed to go back to Giambattista and say, honey, I lost all your drawings. But then she loses the house. So what Cecilia has done is kept Tiepolo busy painting the ceilings all over Venice and outside. He must have really loved Cecilia. All paintings are held together with contrast. It's light against dark, big against small. But the most principal contrast for thousands of years has been light against dark. Light advances and expands. Dark contracts and recedes. Light is the source of inspiration. Darkness, the source of mystery, of threat. This interest can be seen in Guardi's skies. I'm just still revealing light, just different sparkles of light, so that we go from a dark to a light to a dark to a light. It's a light against a dark. That's the idea. And that was the idea for Guardi, because he knows the darker I make any territory, let me just illustrate, the darker I make this territory here, the brighter the building becomes. The sharper I incline it, the more we're aware of it. So if I want to make it stronger, I just make the territory next to it darker versus lighter. I'll do it here too. You see how it helps propel the buildings, and that's Guardi-esque. And where it gets dark, I don't let that dark go against it. I let light go against it, just as he would have. So that we're framing this. You notice I went from a 2-inch to a 1-inch and now to a round. This is Guardi's round, which he treats like he does the pen. He learned calligraphy. He'd learned the scroll work with Antonio, his brother, in his studio. And what he does is he learns to add this kind of calligraphy, but in shadow notes or in bright notes, onto the painting itself. Later, he's going to eliminate much of that and go for a more expressive experience. But at this stage, when he's early in his landscape career, middle-aged man, he'll use this calligraphy as a fallback because of the appetite in his clientele for enumeration. It was the same appetite that would be true for Turner's crowd 50 years, 70 years later. And in both cases, the artist felt freer to dispense with it, but only after they'd done it in the beginning. So here we are. You see how the linear aspect of this is beginning to have some replication with the pen and ink work. All of these marks are a function of him and his pen and ink work. Now, a painting like this of Francesco Guardi's is going to happen over a month or two, working with several at a time. It produces a lot of paintings, but when they're layered, they take steps, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've been doing this alla prima, all at once. And when we do it all at once, we're not able to really glaze like he glazed or let things dry and not mix color. But we're able to block in and get something of the sense of his process, of his removing to find the light, of his using the transparent colors to get some feeling of luminescence. And at any point, he's able to go back and find and scrub out something that gives him a little more of that sense of drama that the light and dark, the chiaroscuro effect, will afford him. It's always available to him. It's a tradition that we see in the skies of Tiepolo, just as much as we see in the skies of Francesco Guardi. Now, in the period of time I've had now, I've had just enough to be able to give you, I think, some feeling for this process. I'm not looking to replicate the process, the palette perhaps, and the perspective system that he uses, but I would need to be doing this in a studio to really give you the full effect, especially of the glazing. But let's pull the tape off now and see where we are. Okay, here we go. It's odd to think that Francesco Guardi, who is well known to expressionist painters of the 20th century and into the 21st century, would be eclipsed for 200 years. The 19th century, with artists like Turner and Whistler still thinking to concentrate on Canaletto, still impressed by the verisimilitude of fact, the landscape of fact, even though they were painting from the landscape of imagination, the landscape of heart and passion. And that's the landscape of Francesco Guardi. That's the legacy, that's the gift he gives to you and me, is that he leapfrogs over a century and comes to us as a contemporary painter, in that he truly transmutes his feelings, his passions into paint. He is giving you a sensation, a feeling, an energy. That means he's going to have to personally interpret. And that is how he opens the door for future artists looking at his work. So that when you and I have a personal encounter with a painting of Francesco Guardi's, we are feeling the presence of a human being whose energy and hand were completely inventive. We're emotional. We're in touch with the canvas as the image is in touch with us. I'm David Dunlop. I'm a landscape painter.